So the popularity and need for a concept like social capital has become really obvious. The popularity of the concept has just continued to increase and increase and increase. And some people have really suggested that social capital was just a fad, a popular trend that would only last for a little while, and then it wouldn't last and it wouldn't be able to survive the test of time. But that's clearly not the case. Hasn't proven to be that way because 30 years on after its initial conceptual development, year after year there continues to be more and more articles published on social capital, and it continues to spread into more and more fields in academia and even outside of academia as well. So I've got a bit of an introduction to start, so you might not see the slides change just for a little while, so don't worry if that's the case. So social capital is a puzzling and somewhat cumbersome combination of words. The term has intrigue and meaning because of the pervasive trends of modernity, particularly within economics, towards methodological individualism, reductionism, and abstraction. Key critics claim that social capital theory is the colonization of social science by neoclassical economics. They claim that social capital applies the language of neoclassical economic theory to social phenomena, therefore powerfully shaping the way we think about and talk about issues. They argue that it naturalizes capitalist ideologies while deprioritizing issues of differential power and inequality. However, other scholars have suggested that social capital may be a response to this colonization, so it could be described as a counter-movement to the forces of modernity. Social capital emphasizes community over market forces and embraces a range of social phenomena in language that suggests their importance and significance. Social capital breaks down the strict methodological rules that modernism believes produces reliable knowledge by engaging in economics, science, philosophy, and social theory simultaneously. This allows for a more genuine conversation rather than universalizing methods across all categories of knowledge. Social capital encourages discursive and qualitative methodologies that modifies practice away from deductive reason, abstract models, and universal categories. As such, social capital can be a tool to transform economic ideology and methodology. So which is it? Is it colonization or is it transformation? Social capital is far from a homogeneous school of thought. So it is feasible that social capital is both a tool for the colonization of the social sciences by economics, as well as a counter-movement to this colonization. Social capital can have such diverse meanings that scholars using the term may not necessarily be talking about the same thing or taking part in the same discussion. Some scholars may intentionally utilize the social capital to colonize other areas of the social sciences. However, I think it is far more common for scholars to be attracted to the concept for its transformative powers. For many scholars, social capital provides access to the investigation of the missing links to explanations of market performance. These missing links have long been discussed in economic theory, all the way back to thinkers such as David Hume and Adam Smith, among many others, and they have continued to be acknowledged at the fringes of economics. While the forces of modernity, particularly methodological individualism, has sidelined these factors from most economic analysis, awareness of their importance has remained. I argue that as the influence of modernity increased, particularly in economics, that did not experience much of a critique of modernism, the need for a concept such as social capital increased. This led to the first systematic exploration of the concept by two different scholars in the late 1970s and 1980s, and who were apparently unaware of each other's work. These scholars were Pierre Bourdieu and James Coleman. The term was used as early as 1900, over 80 years previously, by several different scholars, but did not gain any real traction, and these isolated uses did not create any citation lineage. It was not until the postmodernism gained popularity in the 1980s that the episteme of the time gave the term sufficient meaning and purpose. Interestingly, it did not emerge from economics, but from sociology, since both Bourdieu and Coleman were sociologists. This does not mean that social capital has been an effective transformative tool. The concept has suffered many problems and in many disciplines has struggled for legitimacy and often fallen short. The concept has been frequently adopted by scholars, utilised for a time and then abandoned. It is common to find scholars, including the highly respected and prominent social capital scholars, who have simply moved on from the concept. In broad terms, this has happened throughout entire disciplines and fields of practice. An example is international development and the application of social capital by the World Bank. The concept enjoyed prominence in the late 1990s and early 2000s, only to be largely abandoned by 2010. For many scholars, social capital represents a move away from high theory and ideology to an evidence-based approach. However, the desire for empiricism has often not been accompanied by sufficient theoretical foundations to support rigorous scholarly inquiry. Much of the literature is marred with tautology, excessive assumption of causality, and oversimplification that Ben Fine has described as vulgar scholarship. When confronted with definitional and methodological fuzziness, some scholars go in search of the concept's intellectual origins, hoping to find solid foundations. Unfortunately, what is found is often of little coherence, except perhaps for the rational choice theory foundations that lead back to methodological individualism and excessive abstraction that many scholars were attempting to avoid in the first place. I argue that this leaves many scholars dissatisfied with the concept, since it either fails to provide a move away from modernism or their work struggles for legitimacy. Despite these problems, the concept of social capital continues to increase in popularity. It has gone beyond a temporary fad. After 30 years of growth, many critics have to accept its importance and that it's here to stay. So I think there's some key questions that I'd like to explore in this presentation today. The main ones are about why the concept has become popular and particularly what need it's actually filling. I also want to ask whether or not the concept can deliver on this need and whether or not the required tools to achieve that end actually exist. All right, so the popularity of the concept, let's have a look at what the literature says about this. So social capital has become one of the most popular concepts in the social sciences and even spread to the physical sciences and beyond. Social capital has made a difficult transition beyond academia, being popular in politics in relation to things like the third way. Tony Blair was a big advocate for it, in business, community development, and others as well. And when you actually have a look on Google Scholar and you do a search for the phrase social capital, you find 2.3 million results. So an absolutely enormous number of articles that are on Google Scholar that deal with the issue or topic of social capital. So what I did was I searched the Web of Sciences for social capital over time, and I put together this video that shows how different topics have changed since the early 90s when the conceptual development first started to really take hold, up until current, the end of 2020. So you can see initially it's really sociology and economics that lead the way, primarily because they're interested in the conceptual development initially. And then various other subject areas start to work their way up the chart. So I'll just give you a chance to try and digest this as it moves through. A couple of interesting points. I think you can see that you've got environmental sciences and geography and planning. Most of those are in orange. They eventually end up in the top 10 subject areas. They also have business and economics and management that all end up in the top 5. And in fact, management ends up the top category. And we should acknowledge, of course, that if we were to group some of these categories together into ones that are quite similar, we might end up with some quite different results. But it certainly does highlight just how broadly the concept of social capital has spread across academia, incredibly broadly. So that video is available on YouTube if you want to have a look at it again and sort of digest the sorts of trends and patterns that have occurred. So if we ask this question of why social capital has become so popular, I think there's a few possible reasons for this. The first one is simply people are getting on the bandwagon. It's trendy, fashionable, popular. People want to study it and they want to use it and apply it. And that could be one reason why it's continued to increase in popularity. Social capital is actually intriguing. There is some interest there. It facilitates new investigations and new discussions. And I think that's also a big reason for its growth, is just simply that it provides new opportunities. And I think there is real need to counteract that under-socialized view of modernity and the dominance of neoliberalism. I know for myself personally, when I first became interested in social capital in the early 2000s, I wanted to apply social capital to community groups and the functioning of community groups. I liked the idea of social capital because it highlighted the importance of the social and cultural factors in the effectiveness of these groups. And that's what drew the concept to me. And I think that's why a lot of people become interested in the concept, is because it really speaks about the importance of these social issues that are often overlooked. So again, what does the literature say about this? Since the dawn of time, the survival of human beings has depended on the level of their integration into one or more mutually helpful communities. Those with social support and links with others live better than those who remain isolated. Social capital has such widespread resonance because it provides the name of an intuitive, transcultural recognition that we are inherently social beings. And this has significant consequences for a host of other substantive issues we care about. The concept of social capital draws attention to the effects and consequences of human sociability and the connectedness of their relations to the individual and social structure. So a lot of these ideas relate to that, exactly the nature of what it means to be human, and that in modern times, in modernity, we often overlook the importance of these sorts of social factors. And social capital says that they're important. It's implied within the term itself. So if we have a look at the growth in popularity, it's really changed from obscurity in 1990 to widespread application in really quite a short space of time. So Forsman, in a 2005 publication, used the analogy of social capital as a conceptual sleeping beauty, and that the late 20th century kiss awakened the princess. Now, personally, I don't always think of social capital as a princess. It's quite often a bit ugly and difficult and frustrating to deal with. So maybe it's more like the witch in that analogy. The need for social capital is apparent from the rapid rise in popularity. I think that's pretty clear. It has clear value, utility, and purpose. And especially considering its numerous problems, which we'll talk about next. Social capital clearly communicates or addresses or prioritizes or solves something that was not possible without it. The term clearly has some sort of unique utility that goes beyond what was available previously. So I do want to mention some of the problems with the term because I think the popularity of the term really, these problems are despite the popularity is despite these problems. So the first one is the word capital carries a lot of ideological baggage. And for some people more than others, this is a real barrier to using the term. They get stuck on what it means. They can't understand how social can be capital, and it can be a barrier for moving forward. So it's probably more true for economists than other people, but it can be true for anybody. The word social is incredibly broad, and this really relates to the concept ending up being a bit of an umbrella concept because it includes, social relationships as well as norms and trust and a whole range of different things that fit under this very broad term, social. The term presupposes positive outcomes for a concept that can also have negative outcomes. And this is a real difficulty and continues to be a real difficulty for me, and I think for a lot of other people that use the term, because social capital, in the name itself, in the two words that are involved, it implies that it's positive. Most of the definitions of social capital actually specifically talk about positive outcomes or actions that are cooperative or collective action. And yet we know that social capital can also have perverse outcomes. And this is a real difficulty for using the term. I'm not sure there's any way around it. And depending on who you talk to, of course, but there's certainly a lot of support for this, social capital is impossible to quantify. And so for some economists, it makes it completely undesirable. And of course, that's up to debate, depending on your theoretical perspective and your approach as to whether or not you think that's true. But it certainly is very difficult to quantify with any degree of accuracy. So why did it emerge in the 1990s? So again, referring to the literature and the sorts of ideas that come up. So one of them is that it's actually a response to Thatcherism. So this idea from the 1980s that there's no such thing as society is a possible reason why social capital may have emerged. It's perhaps a direct response to the predominant economic theories and policies of the 1980s as well. Also keeping in mind that in the 1990s, when it really started to grow in popularity, there were a lot of left and centre-left governments in power in the developed world. And that may have contributed towards the rise in popularity at that time. So generally speaking, the rise of neoliberalism contributed to the popularity. A critique of the narrow analytical perspectives on economic activities, from neoclassical school of macroeconomic thinking. So it's really a potential remedy, if you like, for that. A response to the rising political predominance of neoliberalism. So again, neoliberalism does come up quite often as a possible reason for the emergence of social capital. And the historical moment in the mid-90s, after the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the serious economic crises suffered by the post-socialist countries, created a unique space for a social and institutional explanation for how key parts of society work or not. And in fact, Michael Woolcock in that 2010 publication does explore in quite a bit of detail the emergence of social capital. So it would be a good one to have a look at if you're interested in exploring that any further. So I want to explore this period of modern conceptual development. And generally speaking, the contemporary authors are considered to be Bourdieu, Coleman and Putnam. So on the actual graph of the increase in number of articles published on social capital, this is again from the Web of Science database, so it isn't all of the articles that were published. I'd like to position each of these contemporary authors on here so you can see where they fit relative to the increasing trend. So Bourdieu's 1986 publication of The Forms of Capital, he actually published quite extensively in French in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but it wasn't until 1986 that an English publication on social capital gained a bit of prominence. So James Coleman in 1988 on the social capital and the creation of human capital, which is one of the most commonly cited articles on social capital still to this day. And then you have Robert Putnam's key publications in that time. His work on Italy published in 1993, and you can see there that there wasn't all that much of an uptick really immediately after that. But of course, it takes a bit of time for academics to publish articles. But of course, Bowling Alone, which became really a bestseller in 2000 and really thrust social capital into the public eye. So the sorts of publications we're seeing here, Bourdieu's 1986 publication currently has about 55,000 citations on Google Scholar, similar kind of number for James Coleman, similar kind of number actually for Making Democracy Work, Putnam's 93 publication, and Bowling Alone currently has about 87,000. So we're talking about really vast numbers of citations for these key publications. I think part of the reason for this is that people often want to find the conceptual history of social capital. They just fall back and cite these three authors as a bit of a go-to for that. Also wanted to add to this as well, the World Bank interest in social capital. This was kind of the peak interest period. I'll talk a little bit more about the World Bank later on, but they were also a big contributor to driving the popularity of social capital forward. So I want to move on to explore a bit of the historical conceptual foundations of this. And I think a lot of people look back to authors who use the term prior to the 1980s for evidence of the conceptual history. But these authors who published in that period really were using the term without the concept. So there's not really any conceptual history there to have a look at. And that's supported by Ben Fine, who basically says that the history of social capital, except for the last 20 years, so that would take us back to about 1990, is a fairy tale. It's an invention. It just really doesn't exist. So I'm interested in this more from a genealogical perspective rather than a conceptual history perspective, because I'd like to see, these authors were using the term, what is it that they're trying to communicate? Why are they using this term at a time when no one really would have heard it and they wouldn't have known what they were actually talking about? So Putnam identifies 6 independent inventions of the term social capital, concept social capital. It's really only term prior to his interest in the 1990s. So the first one was Hannafan in 1916, who used social capital to communicate the importance of community involvement in schools. Then you have Seeley, Sim and Loosely in 1956 to use social capital to characterize club memberships. You have Jane Jacobs in 1961 to highlight the importance of neighborliness in modern cities. Glenn Lowry in 1977 to analyze the social legacy of slavery. And then these are the contemporary authors, Bourdieu in 1986 and James Coleman in 1988. If we then have a look at that though, Coleman actually cited Lowry, who cited Jacobs, and Jacobs was aware of the Canadian sociologists. So we can actually remove, in terms of independent inventions of social capital, we can remove a few of these. And Hannafan actually cited earlier work by Dewey in 1900, so we can remove Hannafan as well. So there's only really 3 independent inventions of social capital that have been identified in the literature, but most of these really didn't engage with the concept. Of course, Bourdieu here is an exception because he extensively developed the concept. So if we just go back to the original showing these authors who are commonly cited for using the term, we could speculate about what they were trying to communicate. Clearly, I think many of them had the same kind of meaning of the term social capital as what we understand today. So they clearly wanted to communicate the same sort of thing, but these early uses didn't generate much history. The term didn't take off, it didn't create citation lineages, and I think really the time wasn't right. Maybe it was a case of the forces of neoliberalism weren't quite strong enough to warrant this kind of a term. And I think, in fact, the use of the term at that time may have been really strange and people wouldn't have understood it. You really need the right kind of ideological climate for a term like social capital to have relevance and meaning and to be understood and to become popular. And clearly that's something that happened in the 1990s and onward. So people often talk about social capital as being old wine in a new bottle. And so they look even further back to uses of the concept without the term. So prior to the term social capital being used. And this is something that's certainly advocated by Alejandro Portes, who talks about the term does not embody any new idea to sociologists. It just simply captures insights present since the very beginning of the discipline. And I think the same is really true in economics as well. All the way back to Adam Smith, it was really understood about the importance of social and cultural factors, morals and habits of society that really underpin the functioning of the market. So these ideas really say that social capital is just a new term for a very, very old idea. What I thought I'd do is, again, on that same graph, is just position these grand philosophers and theorists who are often cited, just so we can sort of see where they lie relative to the massive increase in popularity in the 1990s. So Karl Marx is often cited, Portes and Woolcock there citing Marx. Durkheim is also cited by various authors for some background to social capital. We have Weber, of course, Woolcock, Portes, Fukuyama all cite him. We have Semel. Portes referencing him. We have Tocqueville, who of course is really the foundation behind Robert Putnam's approach to social capital. Tonnes is in here as well. I'll move through these fairly quickly because I'm not sure how much they really add to our overall discussion, but really this is what we're sort of looking at, is these discussions occurred a very long time before the increase in popularity of the term social capital. So I think what we can do is we can really break down this period into three blocks. We have the concept without the term, and that didn't really end. Of course, these concepts continued to exist all the way up to current times. From about 1900, we have the term without the concept so much, and then from 1986, we have the term and concept and the rapid rise in interest in social capital in that period as well. So quite often social capital is talked about as being, an ideological battleground, integration of sociology and economics. And that's one of the big appeals of it, is that it's a potential way to bridge these quite different disciplines that have really quite different epistemological backgrounds to them. So it's a battle, but it's often not so harmonious a union. And there's a struggle between market individualism and communitarian justice is one way to think about this. And certainly some authors talk about this battle quite a bit and those epistemological foundations of sociology and economics. So as a very broad overview, both of these disciplines are incredibly broad and diverse. And so I'm making some enormous generalizations here about the epistemological foundations of each. Generally speaking, especially within mainstream economics, we can look at actors as the self-interested, rational utility maximizers. Whereas within sociology and social theory, individuals as the naturalistic embedded in social structures. And so some scholars talk about the colonization, that economics, social capital is basically the colonization of social theory by economics. But then others have the other perspective that actually social theory is transforming economic methodologies. And so it could really be either one of these, as I talked about in the introduction. So explore a little bit of the colonization thesis. And I think this is really pushed most by Ben Fine. So in Ben Fine, Fine and Green, 2000, argued that social capital is reductionist to the individual, to utility maximization, and to universalizing categories. In this way, social capital is not an expansion through economic considerations, but a reduction to economic thinking. So this is this idea about colonization. Ben Fine has argued that social capital is the colonization of social science by neoclassical economics. It reshapes the social sciences in the individualistic image of economics, and it is a Trojan horse for economic imperialism. So these are the kinds of ideas that come out about colonization thesis. But of course, it depends on how the concept of social capital is understood and applied. Because as I've suggested, there's also transformative potential as well for social capital. So the development of social capital is part of a trend within both economic and social theory that has moved away from conventional reductionist and objectivist models towards a naturalistic epistemology and an embracing of evolutionary metaphors. Social capital serves as an analytical tool that allowed researchers to consider both the economic and the social function in their analysis. So there's more ideas here, again, from the literature. This is Michael Woolcock. Social capital proved to be an effective rallying point for framing something self-evidently important, our social relationships, in a way that embedded it to be incorporated into policy conversations heretofore dominated by assumptions about interests, cost-benefit analyses, and technical considerations, and by presumptions that individuals and institutions were the only salient units of analysis. And to me, that's something that really rings true, and something that I think social capital can remedy quite effectively, in a way in which it can be a transformative tool. So what is it that social capital communicates, addresses, prioritizes, or solves? So social capital provides a name for an intuitive transcultural recognition that we are inherently social beings. It's highlighted the significance of relational social factors for economic development beyond the under-socialized view of atomistic economic actors. So I think if we graphically represent this potential, that social capital as a concept could be used in a transformative way, or it could be used for colonization. But of course, it's not quite as simple as that, because it's a complex issue that's used in complex ways in many different, it's multifaceted. So it could be neutral, and it's quite complex, or it could be somewhere in between. And I don't want to make a black and white distinction that the use of social capital is either transformative or it's a colonization. Clearly, it can be anywhere in between or a little bit of both, depending on the context. So let's explore a little bit about what colonization might actually look like in a practical sense. How would we be using social capital in a way that contributes towards this colonization? I think the short answer is anything that perpetuates or reinforces the limitations or shortcomings of neoclassical economic theory or methodology. And there's a lot of articles out there that discuss, critique neoclassical economic theory and discuss these kinds of problems. But I've listed what I think are probably some of the key ones here. So certainly methodological individualism. So this is that focus and reduction to the individual, which is really unable to understand the nature of human social experiences. Because humans are social, you can't reduce simply to the individual to understand that. You need to understand the individual within the context of social relationships and social setting and the norms and trust and all of those other things that are so critical to understanding why humans do what they do. Rational choice theory, and certainly the more instrumental approaches to rational choice theory. Again, there are many varieties and variations of rational choice, but overall it's an incomplete explanation for human action. It doesn't account very well for instinct and emotion and a lot of other sort of very human kinds of motivations or reasons for action. Mathematical models that are abstracted from reality and that create excessive deductivism. I think there's another one that we could probably list here that's going to be pushing us more towards the colonization sort of side. Excessive reductionism. That's another one as well. I think that social systems are incredibly complex and they need to be reduced in some way or simplified in some way to be understood more easily. But that can clearly be taken to the point where you just don't have anything really of meaning left anymore. Equilibria is an organizing concept. It's very deterministic. So I think that also pushes towards, in relation to social phenomena, it also pushes towards colonization. The uncritical use of asocial and ahistoric concepts as well. And the market as the primary mechanism for dealing with economic questions. And a little bit of a philosophical one as well on the end here. It's a long list. The fallacy of falsification of social phenomena. That is impossible given the complexity of situations in which the statements are to be tested. How can you actually falsify a social phenomena when there's so many different variables? You can't possibly control for them. How can you possibly attempt to falsify and use that as a methodology for generating knowledge? So I think all too frequently the concept of social capital fails to fulfill in its potential and its promise. And as I've sort of indicated previously, I've identified this pattern, this trend that seems to occur quite often. So what we tend to see is the concept is adopted by somebody or by an organization to solve certain problems or to meet certain needs. But then it's applied in a methodologically familiar way, perhaps in ways that are well established within their discipline or which they're personally familiar with, or ways that are simply considered to be acceptable in the current day and age in modernism. Ultimately, this often proves to be ineffective to solve those initial problems, causes all sorts of difficulties. The concept is then abandoned and further damaged by the, shall we say, poor scholarship that perhaps takes place. And I want to use the World Bank as an example of this. So in 1996, the World Bank launched the Social Capital Initiative. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to respond to the mounting critique of its economic or economist and asocial attitudes. This is really post-Washington consensus, where they're under a lot of scrutiny for the way that they were engaging in the development practice, and they were receiving criticism for basically not taking into account social and cultural factors. So they grabbed hold of social capital as a solution to this problem. And Robert Putnam was really instrumental in providing the guidance for that. At the time, development discourse was really dominated by these really objective, scientific ideas, neoclassical economics, engineering, agricultural science, and these technical capacities. So there's a few authors who describe the events overall and sort of lay a foundation for us. So the World Bank sociologists attempted to use social capital to elevate social and cultural factors in development. That was really the need that they were hoping that it would achieve. What they've described is a battlefield of knowledge within the bank. That's a quote of exactly how they described the discussions around social capital and how it would be applied within development between really the sociologists introducing and championing this concept and the largely economists within the bank who I guess were providing the other side of that battle. Ben Fine described this battle as more of a skirmish and basically abject surrender on the part of the social to the economy. So the social and cultural factors really didn't make much of a headway into development practice as a result. So the version of social capital that was operationalized by the bank was economic, if you like. It still was reductionist. It was still individualistic in its focus. And that's really the version of social capital that we now know and so many people use. Is actually one that was resoundingly defeated, to use the words of Ben Fine and Tony Bevington in the World Bank. So it says a lot about the colonization of social capital. So we've talked about colonization, but what does transformation look like? I'm not sure there's an easy answer for this. The short answer, I think, is not colonization. So we could have a look at the long list of things that contribute towards colonization, and we can try to avoid those kinds of things. But I suspect we actually lack the conceptual tools to support the truly transformative approaches. Keeping in mind, of course, that social capital can be positive regardless, really, because it can open up a discussion, it can have a dialogue, and it can elevate the importance of these kinds of social and cultural issues, regardless of the approach that's being used. So if we have a look at Coleman's conceptualization of social capital, it's actually explicitly based on rational choice theory. Now, it's a rational choice sociology, if you like, or a normative rational choice theory, but it still has a very individualistic approach. So I'd still place it in that category of colonization. Putnam's approach is really based on Coleman's approach. He says this quite explicitly. He of course extended it quite significantly, but it's still really based on, if you look deep within that, it's still a rational choice kind of approach that underpins it. Bourdieu's conceptualization is widely considered to be quite different, and it's also considered to be the most sophisticated sociological approach. However, I would still argue that the action theoretical foundations are a little underdeveloped. Bourdieu has his own theory of habitus, which is an action theoretical foundation, but he doesn't explicitly apply that to social capital. And so we're kind of left assuming that he would use his own sociological apparatus in his own theory of social capital, but I don't think that's been thoroughly developed. And unfortunately, where Bourdieu's work is cited, typically those conceptual foundations are ignored or in fact supplanted with methodological individualism. And I think we've seen that increasingly in the last maybe 10 years, where a lot of people who take a very network approach to social capital tend to actually cite Bourdieu for the definition of social capital, but really ignore the rest of his sociological foundations for the concept. So if we really think about what social capital is, social capital really is fundamentally about human action and the nature of human experiences that influence that action. So included in a lot of the definitions of social capital is some reference to action, that results in cooperation, that creates collective action, that creates productive outcomes. It's really largely about action. So what we need ideally is we require this strong action theoretical foundation that is social, that's not just individualistic, that's not just purely based on an instrumental concept of rational choice. I don't know that that's really been developed thoroughly for social capital at this time. I think there's several excellent treatments that are perhaps more on the fringes of social capital theory, but I'm not aware of anything that really addresses this, and certainly nothing that is popular and commonly cited. I think that there's no shortage of theoretical and philosophical approaches that could be applied to social capital. There's social constructionism and interpretivism and symbolic interactionism and phenomenology, critical theory. I think a lot of these provide the sort of action theoretical foundation that could really provide a strong theoretical foundation for social capital that would allow for the sort of transformative effects that we really want. But I don't think that work's really been developed as yet. So what I want to say a little bit at the end here, I just want to make a comment about pluralism, because I've sort of taken an approach here and given you some broad categorizations from what is an incredibly broad literature, and it's incredibly diverse and complex. And we can't make, these observations, while they're common, they're really not universally applicable. And that dichotomy between colonization and transformation, I really want to emphasize that it's not black and white. And everything's going to be a little bit this or a little bit that, contribute in some way to different outcomes. So we can't just think of it as being a simple black and white situation. Also want to emphasize that all approaches potentially have value and contribute to understanding. So whether or not it engages in methodological individualism or abstraction or reductionism, all of those things that I say contributes towards colonization, potentially there's still a lot of value there, and there's still potentially worthwhile understandings that can come from it. And most importantly, we're still having those discussions. We're still talking about the importance of social and cultural issues. And I think that all of these are a benefit. Really, my motivation here is to hopefully help people to avoid disappointment that comes from conceptual and methodological approaches that fail to actually meet their intended purpose and need. I think so often people see the potential and the promise of social capital, but when they apply it in ways that are conceptually and methodologically perhaps unsuitable to achieve those ends. So hopefully these sorts of ideas can be talked about and explored a bit more, and maybe people can avoid the disappointment and those sorts of failures that cannot so often happen. So that's really it. So open it up for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
Tristan, can I just thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I'm presenting to my colleagues on Monday, and so I will direct them to some of the YouTube videos, if that's all right.
Yes, absolutely.
And I just, that slide, that exercise of the web of science just blows my mind, because my world sits in the world of management and business, and has for 30 odd years or plus more. Now the thing about it is that you're actually sort of talking about it being a battleground, etc. Is it not just, and this is coming from an old HR person, okay? So human resources, we always sit in that nexus between, the economic imperatives of the organisation and the humans that exist within the organisations. So we describe that in HR as a sort of a, line that you actually have to walk constantly in organisations. But I like to think of that as a dialectic that you've actually got to deal with all the time. So I think, I don't want to see it as a battleground myself, etc. But all of what you're talking about is extremely important for us to think in terms of those sorts of things. So it's not a dialectic, a sort of a smoother way of actually, what do you think, of thinking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the battleground terminology is not mine. It's one that I've borrowed from the literature. I'm not
Mm.
sure that it needs to be a battle. I think it needs to be a
Yeah.
discussion, is really what it's about. And I think that you know, there can be concession, there can be a sharing of ideas that can result in, you know, a positive outcome moving forward. I think that it's difficult to really reconcile some of the really mainstream, you know, neoclassical economic methodologies with the sorts of methodologies that we consider to be appropriate in social theory. So I can see how the authors of those articles talk about it as a battleground, because they don't see a middle ground effectively there. But I think it's still really a discussion, and being able to see the benefits in each approach as well is really important.
Yeah. Okay. I'll leave that as my question for the moment. Let everybody else talk.
So who else has a question or something, or a comment or further clarification?
I have so many questions.
Good.
In a nutshell, I am doing a PhD in applied linguistics. And my supervisor is a little innovative. So we decided that I am doing a multi-methodological PhD using tools from outside of applied linguistics. So I am measuring privilege and marginalization of foreign English teachers in Thailand. And I'm using social capital theory to measure privilege and marginalization. And I'm looking at just a few things. I'm looking at social media comments in Thai, not in English, in Thai, of what the Thai society says about foreign teachers. I'm looking at government documents on teacher recruiting, and I have done several in-depth interviews on how the perceptions of the Thai society and what is stated in the government documents, how they affect the self-image of the teachers. So that's my research in a nutshell. And I did not have white hair until I started my PhD. So if anyone has any suggestions on how I might possibly be able to measure an abstract concept, I would really appreciate that. So, okay, thank you.
When I saw you posted that in the Facebook group, and I was immediately intrigued by the conceptual foundation that you would use for that kind of approach, because it immediately, to me, resonates with Bourdieu, because it's largely about, you know, position within a social hierarchy and the various benefits that you are afforded to you as a result of that position, you know, those sorts of social understandings that exist. So as I sort of mentioned, I think Bourdieu's action theoretical foundation is probably habitus, which for anyone who doesn't know what habitus is, it's Bourdieu's own concept about the nature of human experience, that is really about the background presuppositions that influence human action, you know, the nature of our experience. And so I think even though that wasn't well developed and connected by Bourdieu, I think that still, you know, resonates really well with what you're saying. I think the difficulty is in the, you know, 30 or more years since Bourdieu published that, there hasn't been a huge amount of further conceptual development there in that sort of line of thinking. And so even though he's really acknowledged as being sociologically very sophisticated, I don't think that it's sort of progressed as much as some of the other areas of social capital have. And really, because he had a very narrow view of social capital, of course, because he had also had cultural capital as another concept that was separate to social capital, he took quite a narrow view of what social capital was. It doesn't actually fit very well with the current understandings of social capital, I don't think. So I think like I would probably go about it by thinking about, that action theoretical perspective, whether or not there's something there, whether you want to engage with interpretivism or symbolic interactionism or something that can sort of provide an explanation for why, something like, these concepts are going to be important and provide, value, benefit for the individuals involved.
Yeah, it's Dave Williams here. So, Dave, you've got a really interesting challenge there for you, haven't you? But it is, I must say, intriguing on how you will actually do that. And I'm just sort of thinking how you would quantify it and how you would maybe come up with, say, some criteria or indicators that may provide you with an idea about to what extent that phenomenon occurs.
Yeah, it's hard to see how you can avoid. I think the only way you can really get to it is by asking them whether they feel those things, because it seems like they're both, quite subjective kind of experiences. And so whether or not there's a tangible indicator of it, I think it's difficult.
Yeah, unless you're getting a measure of getting them to indicate to what degree they feel an affinity with it, or they feel that that's happening. It's very subjective, but you could, if your sample size was big enough, or if you had enough clarity in your criteria, it's a possibility you could get a comparative measure.
And the other thing to keep in mind, I think, is if you do use Bourdieu, and that you may not, of course, but if you were to, then the habitus is largely pre-reflective. So it's not something that people are necessarily fully conscious of. And so getting them to reflect and to consider the truth of the situation or how they really feel, the nature of their reality, can be quite difficult, especially if you have a time limitation like a survey where you're basically asking them to quickly answer a question. There may not be sufficient time for them to really reflect on a response that really clearly reflects their reality.
Well, I don't know. Fortunately, since we are on semi-lockdown due to the COVID situation, I'm having to do in-depth interviews via email. So that is allowing the participants or the respondents to consider their answers. So, they can take as long as they want. I have used the criteria from the Ministry of Education in Thailand. They give a list of 12 criteria that is the optimum foreign English teacher, age, qualifications, things like that. So I have been able to quantify what the government and also what the society says is the most valuable teacher. And now I am also looking at privilege and marginalization, and that there is another thing I have to look at, dealing with teacher identity. And I am the archetypal foreign teacher. I'm white, male, Western, blah, 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 right? So I'm having to look at all of these issues and considering the identity of the teachers as well, knowing that I am the mighty white man. So, dealing with privilege and marginalization and social capital. I chose social capital because I can ask the teachers and the government how they feel, so I can sort of stay out of it.
Yeah, it sounds interesting. Sounds challenging as well.
I don't know if there's a possibility to use some sort of just thinking, whether you can use analogies. A friend of mine has got a thing called the organizational zoo, a guy in Melbourne, which is a whole lot of archetypes of different types of personalities or behavioral traits that they use for identifying, discussing behaviors in organizations. They're all based on animals. Whether or not that's something you could actually use to tease out, the sorts of behaviors or attributes you might be looking for. I'm happy to send you something on that, Dave. But also, you say you're doing it via email. Is not Zoom or Teams something that you could do as far as like interview?
Again, it's not like what?
Can you use something like Zoom or Teams?
Oh, yes, sure, of course. But I found that dealing with discussing privilege and marginalization, since it is highly introspective, I wanted to give the individuals time to reflect. So that's why I chose emails. And
David, you've found your tribe well and truly, because habitus is a challenge that we actually sort of are looking at constantly. So, and I've been listening to you talk, and identity, you just can't duck away from all of this stuff. So, if it's any use, I've grappled with this for years, the same sort of questions you're asking yourself. And thankfully, I have a wonderful supervisor, who's talked me into using storytelling as part of, I'm looking at company directors and why they volunteer into not-for-profit organisations unremunerated. So the economics of it already sits there, but the concept of habitus is helping me greatly understand, because I actually ask them why they do it, and they say, I should know the answer to that. So, and habitus is a difficult concept, and you can want to flee away from it, but I think it is a wonderful way of actually sort of looking at, and I'm actually sort of looking at stuff on cleft habitus. Your habitus can be split. Also, life story can be in there, and that can actually inform. There's some articles being put up in the last day or two on the phenomenology, the life history, life story, life world, sorry. Yeah. It's a fascinating world, but it's not conceptually sort of straightforward. So, but the storytelling, and I'm actually in write-up stage now. And at the end of the day, this is a difficulty with what Tristan said about social implications, etc. That essentially they all have a different life story that leads them to the same point of volunteering on these boards. So their rationale and their motivation is all very different. But basically it's trying to address their life story at the end of the day. So I don't know if that helps.
Anyway. I think this is also an example of where these sorts of social theoretical foundations are not yet well established. There's some fairly recent work that's being done on like social identity theory, which is really critical to human action, particularly in relation to specific events. But as yet, I haven't seen it well incorporated into social capital theory. And as I mentioned, habitus is Bourdieu's own concept. So I would only assume that it underpins his approach to social capital. But as far as I'm aware, there's nothing really written that establishes that and how it does and in what way. And I think that a very similar concept to habitus, which is, the phenomenological life world concept that you mentioned, Marion, that's been really well developed by authors like Habermas. It's also a much stronger concept, I think, than habitus is, that could be applied to social capital theory. And to the best of my knowledge, that work has not been done at all. And so that could be a really strong action theoretical foundation for social capital, but it doesn't exist yet, as far as I know.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. I think that like the storytelling is great, and particularly like the organisational storytelling is just brilliant stuff. Maybe appreciative inquiry is maybe something that's a little bit more structured than just storytelling, which may be a technique you may be able to leverage off.
Wow, you guys are amazing. I should have done this 2 years ago.
Oh, tell me about it. I wish we would have had this group 4 years ago when I started. I reckon I could have cut 2 years off it. Tristan's fault.
Tristan, I sing your praises every time I have a supervisory meeting. I sing your praises. So thank you.
Yep. No problem. Pleasure to help.
And Jacob, this morning I was on with Jacob, David, doing a writing session, etc. And it's just what these guys are doing is amazing. But anyway, so yeah, you found your tribe. We're all a deeply troubled tribe, but we're a tribe.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying, that analogy about social capital being the sleeping beauty, the princess doesn't always fit. Social capital can really be quite ugly sometimes. I mean, I think I used to probably throw my arms in the air about social capital about once a week. I think that's decreased, and it's probably about once a month now. But I'm sticking with it. 20 years strong, sticking with it.
It has extraordinary value, Tristan, in the world of management and business. It has extraordinary value looking at habitus, etc. So yeah, and no wonder it's become so popularized. Thank you for all your work.
And I think it really does underscore what I was saying, about neoliberalism and modernity, and the economic rationale that is so common now in so many aspects of our life. The real push for competitiveness and individualism and all those sorts of things that so foreign to human nature. And I think that's why the real appeal is, it's just so obvious. It seems so obvious that people grasp onto something like social capital because they can understand it. Whereas I think, like traditional cultures, they wouldn't understand a term like social capital. It'd be, what are you trying to say? Of course, social relationships are important. Of course, my community is important to me. It would be a complete misnomer. It wouldn't make any sense. So social capital only makes sense because of the society we live in now. I think that's really where we're at. And it really underscores the importance of it and the reason why we need to keep going with the conceptual development, keep going in a way that can help us to understand this more and better. So any other questions or comments or clarification? Want to see any graphs or diagrams again? Yeah, Amanul?
I am very glad to see all of scholars on social capital scholars present here. I am from Bangladesh, Aminul Islam. My question is to Tristan. Is there anywhere any social capital foundation? Do you know?
Like a research foundation, do you mean?
Social capital foundation or social capital authority in a state, anywhere?
No, not that I'm aware of. Actually, Jacob and I have talked about this idea of forming some sort of an association that can have the stated goal of developing the theory and trying to provide guidance and direction for people to use the theory, as well as they can. But as far as I know, that has not yet happened.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions, comments?
So my question would be kind of similar to that. You mentioned that that transformative foundational work isn't being done. Those concepts aren't being developed. Is it just for lack of people? Is it for lack of the journey? We're not there yet. Why is that not?
Again, I think it probably comes back to economics. Most academics are in a rush to publish. They're under immense pressure to, pick up a concept, to rapidly research it. That research is done empirically. And so there really isn't time to get into these sorts of theoretical foundations in a particularly meaningful way. I think that's kind of at least part of the answer to the question. And then I think also, like, these are difficult topics. It's difficult to try to piece these conceptual foundations together, and there's many different perspectives about how one might go about doing that. And so there's an enormous amount of conceptual development in the social capital literature, but it's not necessarily taking the sort of approach that I'm taking, that I'm suggesting it should take or could take to be more transformative. So I think that's also part of the equation as well.
And then when you said that you have reduced your throwing your hands in the air to once a month, why do you stick with it? What's your motivation?
My motivation is the same as it was 20 years ago. You know, I feel that it's really an important concept. The reason why I think it happens less frequently now is because I've developed quite a lot of the conceptual work that I felt was missing. And so I feel more content, you know, and more satisfied with the theoretical foundations that exist through my own work and also through others. You know, I definitely can't claim, you know, much credit for a lot of the work that I do. You know, if I apply Life World to social capital, I'm using, you know, the fantastic work done by Habermas and Schultz and, you know, those other people within that tradition that developed those theories, and I'm simply applying them to social capital. It's kind of the easy part. So I don't want to take credit for that sort of thing, you know, too much, but I feel like, you know, that work is ongoing, and I feel like the situation is slowly improving.
I have more questions. Oh, Samantha, you go ahead. Nope.
I'm just curious. So this is completely new to me. This is like my first real foray into these ideas. So you'd mentioned that a lot of the resistance comes from it not being able to be quantified necessarily. You know, I come from a background in journalism and English where it was still, you know, qualitative was kind of a bad word sometimes. So I guess, how does it lend itself more to working with qualitative studies and kind of bolstering that, especially in terms of like media studies and journalism and communication? Have you come across anything like that?
I think the reason why social capital really encourages qualitative types of methodologies is because it's very difficult to really understand the complexity of the concept and what's really going on in a social setting unless you do use qualitative. And so it encourages people to do so. There's an enormous amount of resistance to it. I remember even in my undergraduate in the 1990s, in the sociology department of my university, you know, there'd virtually be physical fights between sociologists who thought everything should be done quantitatively and those who thought it should have been done qualitatively. And so these sorts of passions run very deep, and that's just within one discipline. And really, particularly within economics, you know, if you can't quantify it, then you don't even talk about it. You know, don't even bring it up as a possible research topic. It has to be quantifiable, and that's not true in, of course, all economic departments, but it certainly is in some. And so I think that you've got this real challenge to bring people around to different ways of thinking about knowledge and collecting knowledge, and different the validity of different methodologies. And you know, we've had this positivist approach that unless you can quantify it, you know, it's too subjective and it's not real, it's not valid unless you can. But a lot's happened in the last 20 or 30 years, and I think increasingly that qualitative data is considered to be valid. But there still is a lot of emphasis, you know, gets placed on even the way that it's collected. So, you know, methodologies like action research still get very heavily criticized because, you know, the researcher is a participant in the research and therefore they're somehow not objective. And I would argue the opposite. You know, how could they not know? They know everything there is to know about the research situation because they're a participant in the research context. So I think, you know, those sorts of issues are really complex. I'm not really sure I've answered your question though. Do you want to redirect me to answer it better?
No, you have actually. Sorry, it's 2 a.m. here, so I'm probably not very articulate right now. But yeah, no, you definitely answered my question. Thank you.
So Amanda, do you have another question?
Yes, yes, I do. I have very noisy deaf children in the background, though. I'm wondering if it's safe to take my mute off. You mentioned that not all outcomes, when you're talking about the definitions of social capital, that there are negative outcomes, that not all social capital is positive. And can you expound on that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So this idea was originally sort of put forward by Alejandro Portes, like all the way back in 1998. And it's been picked up by quite a lot of people. So there's some really obvious examples of where the outcomes of exactly the same social setting can be negative rather than positive. So situations where a group becomes very heavily bonded, a lot of very close social relationships, everyone knows everybody, and you can get things like cognitive lock-in, where it really limits the options for the people to be able to act in ways that are outside of the norm. Whether the norm's positive or negative, it's still it's often considered to be a perverse outcome because it doesn't give the freedom to be able to act in different ways. And it can really stifle creativity and problem solving and innovation in those kinds of situations. And also in those situations, if you're on the in-group, it might be all well and good, but if you're on the outside, then you're excluded from those kinds of groups. And so exclusion is often considered to be another, negative outcome that can come from a social setting that would otherwise have positive outcomes. And there's various other ones as well. Definitely in social capital, more of something is not necessarily better. There's quite a lot of non-linear relationships. Even trust, more trust is good. Too much trust can actually allow for the opportunity for people to be opportunistic in that sort of situation. So, it's a very complex kinds of relationships that exist. And certainly not everything's positive.
Yeah, and certainly a good example is the social identity theory, where the stronger people, as you say, the more stronger people identify with the in-group, they say the more people compare themselves with other groups, and quite often negatively. So they look at other groups as being inferior or competitive, and that can even lead to quite destructive behaviour with those other groups that they're comparing themselves with.
So David was asking about the name of that theory. So I think David Williams, I think you were talking about social identity theory, weren't you? Yeah.
Yep.
Which is a psychological theory, by the way. It's out of psychology. Probably social psychology, actually. So any other questions or comments?
Amanda, just sorry, at some stage I'll actually do a presentation on this, but also I'm looking at company directors, and they use their strategic cognition, strategic thinking as a form of social capital that they sort of trade between various areas, and in this case between not-for-profit and commercial. And at the end of the day, my view becomes that the end result, the move to commercialization in the not-for-profit, is not a good area. And these people are actually, perpetuating it? They're actually pushing it forward, commercialization of not-for-profit organizations. So that's another larger picture of social capital being used as individuals need to do something for themselves that has greater implications. So anyway, I thought I'd mention that, sorry.
All right, any other final questions? I think if not, we might wrap up. Feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask. All right, I think we can wrap up. I don't know that we have a topic for the next time. We try to run these sessions every 2 weeks. and anybody is welcome really to present. If you're doing a PhD or you're doing some other research, then a presentation can be a really great way to get some feedback and to formulate your ideas. So if you would like to give a presentation at a future session, get in contact with me or post something in the Facebook group so we can organize a time. We do invite other academics and experts in the field of social capital and related concepts to give presentations from time to time. So keep an eye out. The 6 p.m. UTC session will be coming up in, well, 11 or so hours from now. And we have a PhD student from France who's going to be giving a presentation about apartheid and social capital, which I think will be quite interesting if you are able to take part in that. Otherwise, you might be able to catch the video later. So stand by for the next topics in 2 weeks from now, hopefully, and get in contact if you would like to present. All right, thanks everyone for taking part.